I never considered myself the romantic type, so it wasn't love at first sight with Claire. We met at university, in the boisterous whirlwind of our early 20s when everything felt possible but nothing felt certain. My best friend, Alan, introduced us, his eyes alight with something I hadn't seen before, hope, perhaps, or infatuation. They were an item then, if you could call it that. Alan was a dreamer, the kind of man whose aspirations were vivid but directionless. I, on the other hand, was pragmatic, grounded. And perhaps that's what Claire saw in me, or maybe it was just proximity. I'll never know if I truly won her heart or if I simply outmaneuvered Alan. Our relationship moved quickly, almost as if it had a momentum of its own. She was barely able to catch her breath before we were engaged. Alan was furious, of course, but he masked it under a veneer of polite withdrawal. To this day, I sometimes wonder if she resented the speed of it all, the way I swept her into my world without giving her time to assess whether it was where she wanted to be. But we settled into married life, and I convinced myself that she loved me. We had 2 beautiful children, Claire threw herself into raising them, and I focused on building a stable career. It wasn't passionate, but it was steady, and I thought steady was enough. Years rolled by, and we became the kind of couple people envied for our longevity. 30 years of marriage, 2 grown kids, a comfortable home, by all appearances, we had succeeded where so many others faltered. But beneath the surface, there were cracks I was too blind to see. I mistook Claire's quiet for contentment and her distance for the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. Looking back, I can see it clearly, the way she would pause before responding to me, the moments when her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. When our university announced a 30-year alumni reunion, Claire was surprisingly enthusiastic. She dug out old photos, reminiscing about those chaotic, exciting years in a way I hadn't seen her do in decades. I watched her with a mixture of amusement and pride, grateful for a rare glimpse of her youthful energy. It didn't occur to me to ask why she seemed so eager to reconnect with a past I thought we'd left behind. She insisted on going alone. "You never liked those things," she said lightly, brushing off my half-hearted offer to accompany her. I didn't press the issue. She packed a bag, kissed me goodbye, and promised to call me from the road. I trusted her implicitly, never suspecting that this trip would become the catalyst for the unraveling of everything we'd built. The call came late that night, her voice trembling just enough to unsettle me. "It's been so wonderful seeing everyone," she said, but the words felt rehearsed, hollow. I told her I loved her, and she paused long enough to plant a seed of doubt I wouldn't fully understand until much later. When Claire came back from the reunion, there was something different about her, a lightness, an energy I hadn't seen in years. She smiled more often, her laughter carrying a tone of nostalgia that made her seem, strangely, like a younger version of herself. It was disarming, in a way, but I told myself that it was a good thing. After all, a weekend of old friends and familiar faces had clearly done her some good. I wanted to believe it was that simple. She talked about the reunion often over the next few days, recounting moments from the night with a wistful glow. Names of classmates drifted in and out of the stories, many of whom I vaguely remembered from the early days of our relationship. She showed me pictures on her phone, smiling faces frozen in time, clustered around the banquet tables and the dance floor, each one seemingly pulled back into the golden haze of their youth. "I didn't realize how much I missed those days," she admitted one night as we sat in the living room. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant. "It's funny, isn't it? How life sweeps you along, and before you know it, decades have passed." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Something about her tone was unsettling, as though she were mourning a life she no longer had. But I didn't dwell on it. I told myself she was just reminiscing, as people tend to do after reunions. I even felt a pang of guilt for doubting her happiness. As the days turned into weeks, Claire's enthusiasm didn't wane. If anything, it grew. She started taking long walks in the evenings, claiming they helped her clear her head. She spent more time scrolling through her phone, occasionally laughing to herself as if caught up in a private joke. I asked her about it once, and she brushed it off with a quick, "Oh, just the group chat from the reunion. Everyone's still catching up." She smiled as she said it, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Life went on as usual, or so it seemed. Our routine stayed intact, our conversations pleasant. But beneath the surface, a quiet tension had begun to build. Claire's phone would buzz during dinner, and she would glance at the screen with an expression that was hard to read: curious? Excited? Guilty? I couldn't tell. One Saturday, she told me she was meeting a friend from the reunion for coffee. "It's just nice to reconnect," she said, slipping on a pair of earrings I hadn't seen in years. She kissed my cheek and left with a spring in her step. I watched her go, wondering why her absence felt heavier than it should. When she came home that evening, she was radiant. She hummed as she moved about the house, her face aglow with something I couldn't name. I asked her how it went, and she answered with a breezy, "Oh, it was lovely." We talked for hours. It's amazing how quickly the years melt away when you're with someone who knew you back then. Her words hung in the air long after she left the room, a faint echo that didn't quite fade. Something about the way she said, "back then," struck a chord deep within me. It wasn't longing or regret, it was something far more complicated, something I couldn't yet define. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I stared at the ceiling, trying to quiet the unease that had begun to grow in the pit of my stomach. I told myself it was nothing, just the result of my overactive imagination. But the shadows in the room felt heavier than usual, and the space between us seemed wider than I'd ever noticed before. For 30 years, I thought I knew every corner of Claire's heart. But now, as her even breathing filled the silence, I realized that there might be parts of her I had never seen, parts that had nothing to do with me. And for the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out what they were. Claire's newfound energy persisted, and though I tried to ignore it, it gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. She seemed almost buoyant, rediscovering a spark I hadn't seen in her for years. She started spending more time out of the house, claiming she needed space to think or time to herself. I wanted to trust her, it was Claire, after all, but something in me couldn't help noticing the shifts in her routine, subtle as they were. Her walks grew longer. Her errands became more frequent. She started dressing differently, trading her comfortable jeans and sweaters for more tailored outfits that hugged her figure in ways I hadn't seen in decades. I tried to compliment her once, "You look lovely today," but she only smiled distantly, as though my words had come from a stranger. It was hard not to feel like I was watching her drift away, caught in a current I couldn't name. But whenever I asked her about it, she would laugh softly and brush off my concerns. "You're overthinking things," she said more than once, her tone kind but final. "I'm just rediscovering myself." Rediscovering herself. The phrase echoed in my mind long after she said it, and I wondered what it meant. For 30 years, Claire had defined herself in so many ways, as a wife, a mother, a caretaker. Had she grown tired of those roles? Did she feel trapped by the life we'd built together? I didn't know how to ask her without sounding accusatory, so I stayed silent. It was easier that way. Then, one evening, I came home to find her sitting at the dining room table, a glass of wine in one hand and a photo album in the other. Her face was soft, her eyes misty as she flipped through the pages. I recognized the album immediately. It was from our university days, a relic of a time we rarely spoke about anymore. "Taking a trip down memory lane?" I asked, trying to sound casual as I set my briefcase down. She looked up, startled, as though she hadn't heard me come in. "Oh, yes," she said with a small smile, closing the album. "I was just reminiscing. It's funny how much you forget until you see it again." I nodded, but something about the way she closed the album felt too abrupt, too deliberate. She excused herself soon after, retreating to our bedroom with her glass of wine. I stayed behind, staring at the closed album on the table, debating whether or not to open it. Curiosity 1. I sat down and flipped through the pages, scanning the faces of people I hadn't thought about in years. Claire and I were there, of course, laughing at parties, posing on the quad, holding hands on the steps of the library. But there were others, too. Names I barely remembered. Faces blurred by time. And then, I saw him. Daniel. He was in several photos, always near Claire. In one, they were sitting together on a bench, her head thrown back in laughter as he leaned in close, a playful grin on his face. In another, they were dancing at a party, his hand resting casually on her waist. My stomach tightened as I stared at the images, memories I had long buried clawing their way to the surface. Daniel had been one of her closest friends back then, closer than I liked. I remembered the way they'd gravitated toward each other, their easy camaraderie that always seemed to teeter on the edge of something more. I remembered how she'd brushed off my concerns, insisting that they were just friends, that I had nothing to worry about. And I remembered the way he'd looked at her, like she was the only person in the room. I closed the album and sat back, my heart pounding. It was just a photo, I told myself. Just a relic of the past. But the unease that had been gnawing at me for weeks suddenly felt sharper, more defined. For the first time, I wondered if Claire's nostalgia wasn't just about revisiting the past, but reclaiming it. Later that night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the past few weeks. The phone buzzing with messages. The unexplained absences. The glow that seemed to radiate from her after every outing. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this was just a phase, a harmless quest for self-discovery. But as I lay there in the dark, a single thought took root in my mind, refusing to let go. I didn't know her anymore. At least, not the version of her that had returned from that reunion. It was a Friday evening when the pieces began falling into place. Claire had been gone for hours, having left in the late afternoon with nothing more than a vague excuse about meeting an old friend. She didn't offer details, and I didn't press her for any. Instead, I stayed home, pacing the house and trying to distract myself with mindless tasks. But no amount of busywork could quiet the questions circling in my head. Around 8, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Claire was meticulous about keeping it with her, so seeing it left behind was unusual enough to draw my attention. The screen lit up with a notification, a message from D. It was brief, a single line, but it hit me like a blow to the chest. Tonight was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. My hands trembled as I stared at the words. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, not to assume the worst. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just a casual message from an old friend. The intimacy of it, the way it lingered on the screen like a challenge, was undeniable. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself there was some benign explanation. But then I saw the message thread. The messages were frequent and casual at first, but as I scrolled further, their tone shifted. Words like, "miss you," "our secret," and "that night at the lodge" stood out like neon signs. My stomach churned as I pieced it together. Daniel wasn't just part of her past, he was her present, too. The weight of it pressed down on me, sharp and suffocating. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, but instead, I set it down gently, as if handling it too roughly would make everything worse. My world had tilted off its axis, and all I could do was brace myself for the fallout. Claire came home just after 10, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly disheveled. She didn't look guilty, but there was a brightness in her eyes that only deepened my suspicions. "You're still up?" she asked, her tone light, as if nothing was amiss. "I couldn't sleep," I replied, my voice strained. "How was your evening?" She hesitated for just a moment, a fleeting pause, but long enough for me to notice. "It was nice. Just catching up with an old friend." I nodded, pretending to accept her answer, even as the weight of her deception threatened to crush me. I wanted to confront her right then and there, to demand the truth, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear of what she might say, or maybe it was the growing realization that I needed a plan. Whatever the reason, I let her words hang in the air and watched as she disappeared into the bedroom. Once I was alone, I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the suffocating tension inside. I walked aimlessly, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to answer. How long had this been going on? Did she ever love me, or had she simply settled for the life I offered? And most importantly, what was I going to do now? As the hours passed, a dark resolve began to take shape. I couldn't let this betrayal go unanswered, not after 30 years of marriage, of sacrifices, of building a life together. If Claire thought she could deceive me, then she didn't know me as well as she thought. I would find a way to confront her, but on my terms. And if Daniel thought he could swoop in and reclaim her without consequences, he was about to learn otherwise. By the time I returned home, my course of action was clear. Claire might think she had all the power, but I would show her, and him, that I wasn't the kind of man to be cast aside. Not without a fight. The morning after Claire's late return, I left the house before she woke up. I told her I had a work meeting, but in truth, I needed space, to think, to act, to steel myself for what lay ahead. I couldn't confront her without proof, and I couldn't bring myself to go on pretending. So I drove to a quiet cafe and called a private investigator. Hiring someone felt drastic, almost theatrical, but I needed clarity. If I was wrong, I'd deal with the fallout. But if I was right, I couldn't live with only half the truth. Within a week, I had everything I needed. Photos, timestamps, even video footage of Claire meeting Daniel at a secluded hotel on the edge of town. The man I'd seen in the photos from college, now gray-haired and thick around the middle, was holding my wife's hand, leaning in too close, laughing with a familiarity that churned my stomach. That night, as I sat alone in my car, staring at the evidence, anger and pain burned through me in equal measure. 30 years of loyalty, of sacrifice, of compromise, and this was how it ended? But as the rage subsided, a cold, calculating clarity took its place. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I packed an overnight bag and told Claire I'd be out of town for work. It was a plausible excuse, she didn't question it. As soon as I left, I drove straight to Daniel's address, the investigator's report clutched in my hand like a weapon. I didn't care about discretion anymore. If Claire thought she could rewrite our story with him, I would unravel his life just as he had unraveled mine. It was Daniel's wife who answered the door. She was petite and pleasant-looking, with kind eyes that betrayed no hint of suspicion. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but wary. "Yes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think you need to see this." I handed her the envelope of evidence, my heart pounding as I watched her expression shift from confusion to shock. She flipped through the photos, her face draining of color with each one. I don't understand," she stammered, looking up at me with wide eyes. "What is this?" "It's the truth," I said, my voice hard. "Your husband and my wife. I thought you deserved to know." She stood there in stunned silence, her trembling hands clutching the photos. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Her tone was hollow, as if the ground beneath her had given way. I turned to leave, but her voice stopped me. "What are you going to do?" I paused, considering her question. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I'm not going to let them get away with it." The confrontation set a chain reaction in motion. Within days, Daniel's wife filed for divorce, her resolve as firm as her fury. Claire, blindsided by the fallout, confronted me in tears. "Why would you do this?" she demanded, her voice cracking with disbelief. "Why?" I repeated, my voice colder than I thought possible. "Because you didn't just betray me, you betrayed everything we built together. And you thought you could do it without consequences." Her defenses crumbled under the weight of my words and the evidence I'd gathered. She tried to explain, to justify, to blame it on a midlife crisis or a rekindling of old feelings. But I didn't care anymore. Her reasons were as hollow as her promises had become. I filed for divorce the next morning, determined to sever the ties that had bound us for 3 decades. I had no desire to rebuild something that had been shattered so thoroughly. Daniel's life didn't escape unscathed either. His wife, armed with the same evidence I had, left him without hesitation. His children, grown but devastated, turned their backs on him. And Claire? She moved into a small apartment downtown, a far cry from the home we had shared. It wasn't the ending I had imagined for our story, but it was an ending I could live with. I didn't feel victorious, nor did I feel whole. Betrayal has a way of hollowing you out, leaving scars that never quite fade. But I knew one thing for certain: I would rebuild, piece by piece, on a foundation of truth. And Claire and Daniel could live with the ruins they had created. Together, or apart, it didn't matter to me. As I stood in the empty house that final night, the echoes of our shared life reverberating in the silence, I realized that letting go wasn't the same as losing. It was an act of reclaiming, of stepping into a future that was still mine to shape. And for the first time in months, I felt free. After 30 years of marriage built on compromise and unspoken doubts, a university reunion rekindles a buried connection for Claire. What begins as nostalgia unravels into betrayal, leaving her husband with a choice: walk away quietly or dismantle the lives of those who dared to deceive him. In a storm of heartbreak, vengeance, and unexpected revelations, the line between love and justice blurs in ways neither of them could have foreseen.